You're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Durgan. I'm very pleased to welcome Stephen Proctor to today's show to introduce us to the story of the rise of women's golf from the 1860s, which he captures so beautifully in his third book entitled Matchless, due to be published by Berlin Books and released in October 2025. Over the course of the next hour, Stephen shines a light on some of the early pioneers of the game on both sides of the Atlantic, laid the foundations in inspiring the two leading women in this story, namely the incomparable duo of Joyce Wethered and Glenna Collet, the dominant players in the post-Great War period. It's a fascinating story. Many thanks to Stephen for his time, and please do remember to buy the book when it comes out later this year. Thanks for tuning in. Stephen Proctor, you're once again very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. How are you? And how is the Floridian summer been so far?
I am doing great, Shane, and I'm delighted to be back here on the podcast. I thank you for having me. It's ungodly hot in Florida this time of year, although I have to say that this summer has been somewhat milder than previous summer. So in that regard, I'm pleased. But I travel a lot in the summer, schedule most of my travel for July and for August, just so that I'm someplace. If I go anywhere in the United States in those months, I'm someplace cooler than here, usually.
Well, you were last on the Firm and Fast, basking in the afterglow of the publication of your last book, The Long Golden Afternoon, a cracking exposition of the evolving golden age of golf from 1864 to 1914. Incidentally, just for listeners that aren't aware, that particular book was shortlisted for both the 2023 Sports Book Awards and indeed the very impressive USGA Herbert Warren Wind Book Award. Since then, you've started up a podcast of your own with your good friend Jim Hartzell under the No Laying Up podcast banner, no less. Just in case listeners have not heard of the Duffer's Guide, you might give us a quick introduction as to what they might expect were they to subscribe to your monthly releases.
Well, thank you for that, Shane. Jim and I have such fun time doing this. A long time ago, we were both on a No Laying Up podcast in which we were asked to list our 15 favorite golf books along with Michael Wolf, who goes by Bama Bearcat on Twitter and is a person who has an extraordinary collection of golf books and a great deal of knowledge about the game to go with it. And that was a really fun podcast, and both of us got such enormous response from the followers that we have that we wanted to try to do it again. And, Big Randy and those guys, they have so much going on. That wasn't something they were inclined to repeat. And Jim and I just decided after a while, well, we'll just do it ourselves. And we started our own book podcast called The Duffer's Literary Companion. I'm a big fan of radio, and the Prairie Home Companion on NPR has always been something that I loved listening to over the years, and I sort of ganked the name from that. But The Duffer's Literary Companion is a once-a-month podcast. We choose mostly classical golf books that you probably have not been introduced to. Our most current episode is on A Game of Golf, Francis Ouimet's memoir that he wrote in 1932 after his second U.S. amateur, and it's really about the great amateur age of golf in America and to some extent in Britain as well, as he's always traveling there to compete. So I think listeners who like to read and enjoy golf we've had some really nice responses to it, and it gets fairly decent little following. So it's been fun to do, and we're now starting our third year of doing it. We've been doing it for 2 years now.
Fantastic. Well, as you know, from time to time, I like to recommend not only your own work, but others operating in this shared space of ours. Stuff that's worth exploring and supporting with both time and, dare I say it, hard-earned money. In addition to all things, as I said, Stephen Proctor touches, I'm pleased to share some exciting news that our mutual friend, Richard Pennell, has completed a new book entitled Common Grounds. And it's currently queued for printing by Grant Books, his publisher. Common Grounds focuses on some of the more rustic and pared-back golf experiences that Richard has had over the past number of years, and it should be out over the coming months. If you don't already subscribe to Richard's weekly blog at Pitchmarks and Substack, I would suggest that you rectify that omission by following the link I've included in the show notes of this episode. Through there, you will be amongst the first to receive news on the publication of Common Grounds. You've got to know Richard a bit over the past few years, Stephen. I'm assuming that you would second my endorsement of his talent.
Absolutely. Richard is a lovely writer, but more important than that, I think Richard is just a unique thinker about the game of golf. And I love the worldview that he brings to the game. I do think there is a kind of a cadre of people who look at the game in a unique way, who like it for its elemental aspects, for the companionship that goes with it, much more so than the professional game and other things. And Richard impresses me as a leader of that thought group. And I loved we had him on, the Duffer's Literary Companion, for his first book, and this should be a great one too. So I read Pitchmarks regularly, and I adore Richard, so I couldn't have seconded it more enthusiastically.
Excellent. Well, with the recommendations and the public service announcements out of the way, let's jump into the real reason we've convened today. Following on from the significant success you've had with your first two books, you've recently finished another book which is due out over the coming months. This book is entitled Matchless, Joyce, Wethered, Glenna, Collet, and the Rise of Women's Golf. By way of a starting point to this afternoon's chat, I'm initially keen to understand what drew you to the particular subject matter that has become Matchless.
Two things, and the first one is that, I was not a person who played golf a lot as a young man. I played for one summer with a friend, got injured, and didn't get back to the game until I was 40 years old or thereabouts. And after that, I had sort of what P.G. Wodehouse would call a Mortimer Sturgis moment, where I went completely insane for golf. And one of the very first people that I got to play golf with, who was a very serious golfer, was my wife's aunt, Ruth Ann Schwederman, who is the 5-time champion of her club in Minster, Ohio, Arrowhead Golf Club. And she's always been a mentor and an inspiration to me. And actually, this is the first of my 3 books that will have a dedication, and it is dedicated to Ruth Ann, who has been my inspiration. So I've always had women in my golfing crew most of the time. Very soon after I had that Mortimer Sturgis moment, I moved out to San Francisco, California to take a job there at the newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle. And 2 of my regular player friends there were April Kenyon, who was an executive coach in Human Resources Department, and I worked with her on becoming a better boss, and Susan Fornoff, quite well-known sports writer. And it so happened that April was the president of the 4 Women's Golf Association of the Bay Area, and she asked me, when she found out that I was starting a serious study of golf history, and I had been doing that starting about 2003, she's asked me to be the guest speaker for her group and do a talk about women's golf. And I pointed out that the one problem with that was that I didn't know the first thing about women's golf history. And she said, well, the event's 3 months away. You have plenty of time to study. So I went and did it because April's just a wonderful human being, and I thought I should do it. So I decided that the easy way to approach that would be to let's just do a talk where if you named all the great accomplishments in the game, the best season ever had, the best golf swing ever developed, the best match ever played or whatever, what case could you make for a woman above men? And that was the point of the talk. And of course, 2 of Glenna and Joyce both figured in that. Joyce as the person who had developed the best swing ever, and I still think that's true. Well, let's put it this way. No person has developed a better understanding of the golf swing and a more pure and proper execution of it. Other people have equaled it, but none have surpassed it, would be the point of view that I would say. And then the second one was best season ever, and that was Glenna Collet. And Glenna's 1924, Glenna played in 60 matches and won 59 of them. And the one that she lost on a freak occurrence. There was the stymie rule, of course, was still in effect in 1924. Her ball was on the putting green. Her opponent's ball caromed off her ball and into the hole. And in that way, she won the match. So that was the only loss Glenna had during the year 1924, which is about as close to the perfect season as I'm aware any person has come to in any game. Um, so those two have always been in my mind. And I realized during the course of even that little bit of research that they were rising to a point of brilliance at the exact same time on opposite sides of the Atlantic. Glenna won her first U.S. Women's Amateur in 1922. Joyce won her first British Ladies Championship in 1922. And from there until 1935, when Glenna won her last U.S. Amateur and Joyce made her triumphant tour of the United States, they had been a dominant pair and a hugely influential pair I could see even from that research. So I've had that story in the back of my mind for a long time. But honestly, Shane, I don't think you could start out as an unknown person attempting to write about women's golf right away. So I felt like I needed to establish myself as a historian and writer in a field other than journalism, which obviously I was an established journalist. But in order to take on a topic like that, because, obviously women represent about a quarter of all golfers, I believe, from the latest RNA study. And so you're taking and writing a book that's directed partly to a niche audience within a niche, which is golf itself. So I didn't feel like I could take that on right away. And I also had other books I wanted to do, but I always did want to do this one. And after the long golden afternoon, it seemed like the perfect time then, partly because women's sports in generally seems to have been on an uptick with people like Caitlin Clark and other things. And then, women's golf in particular seems to be in a good space in terms of stars and players and the quality of the game that's being played on the LPGA and elsewhere. So I thought it was a good time to do it now.
Well, as a complete aside, Stephen, and you'll probably be aware that last weekend we had Lottie Woad, the English amateur, winning the Irish Open for professional golfers. And in fact, I just noticed that she came up one shy in the Amundi Evian Major in France today as well. So good times for amateur women.
I have watched her throughout her amateur career. She's an exceptional golfer. And I wouldn't have been the slightest bit surprised if she'd won the Evian Championship today. She ended up coming up one shot shy, but my goodness, what a performance for an amateur, and what a thing it would be if an amateur were to win a major championship. And I am going to predict right here on Firm and Fast Golf that is going to happen sometime soon, because across the board in men's golf, women's golf, elsewhere, players are coming out at a young age in a sort of Tommy-like way, where they're ready to conquer the world at the age of 19. And they have not only the playing skill, but they seem to have because they start competing at such a young age now in serious competitions, they often have the mental development that's required to win something like that at a far younger age. So I believe we will see that again, that a college student will win a tournament or a major in the next 5 years or so. I can't say it seems very likely to me.
Well, you shared the Matchless manuscript with me in advance of our chat today. I must say it's an immensely enjoyable read, providing great colour and detail. You've obviously completed a significant deep dive into this time period through an extended exposition, teasing out particular themes and connections. Just wondering initially how long the research process and the writing took for the book.
Well, I started this book, and I normally do start another book the minute I publish the one I just finished. So I published The Long Golden Afternoon in 2022, and I immediately began to work seriously on this book. And during that time, I also went on along the Old Tom Morris Trail. I think you know about that. And while I was there, I stayed for 4 days in Gullen, Scotland, and one of the great and leading figures of women's golf and women's golf history lives in Gullen, Scotland, named Gillian Kirkwood, and a really distinguished woman. And I was having lunch with the proprietor of Jack White's, Boris Litzo, because we were going to go play Hickory Golf together. And I mentioned to him that I was going to work on a book about Joyce Wethered and Glenna Collet next. And Boris is kind of a spaz, and he immediately left the bar, got his car, brought it back, and drove us over to Jillian Kirkwood's house unannounced. He just barges in the front door of her house, which I guess is, they have a relationship where that's possible, and just drags me in and introduces me to Jillian Kirkwood. And, I had heard of Jillian Kirkwood, and she had heard of me too, because she had read my books, and we had a wonderful little chat. And basically, I took the opportunity to take a picture of Jillian's bookshelf because I figured that would be a very good place to begin studying for a serious project of this nature. And there were 26 or so volumes on it that were devoted to women's golf and women's golf history. So I bought all of those to begin, those 26 books, and started by reading those 26 books. And I felt like once I'd done that, I was probably ready to start diving into the story in more depth, because I felt then if you've read everything that Jillian's read, or well, at least that she had on her shelf visible, she's probably read a lot more than that. You're at least, you seem like you're primed to begin. So I did that, and then I went into newspaper research after that. And it took altogether 2.5 years or so altogether, once you, year and a half for the research and then a year of writing.
Well, in preparing for our chat this afternoon, I came to the conclusion that a chronological approach was probably optimal, allowing us time to move from the general to the specific while exploring the underlying historical, evolutionary and legacy themes that resonate from the book. Matchless obviously deals with a time period that stretches from about the 1860s to the present day, maybe. You might set the scene by introducing us to the societal and golfing backdrop that underpins the Matchless story.
Well, I think the thing that's interesting, Shane, is that it became obvious when I started researching this that from the minute men started putting on a red jacket and going over to the club for golf and claret with their buddies, women wanted to play. There is a wonderful report in the Caledonian Mercury in 1738 of two women from the city of Edinburgh playing a match at Bruntsfield with their husbands as caddies. And from then on, there are reports of women playing golf, often in what would be viewed in that age as impertinent ways. The fishwives of Musselburgh were recorded as playing in early 17, I forget the dates off the top of my head now, but in the late 1700s. And then, of course, the club in 1811, I believe it was, gave prizes for a tournament among fishwives at the Musselburgh Golf Club. And in 1855, the daughter of the most revered figure probably in the history of the Royal Nation, John White Melville, started going out onto the St. Andrews links with a couple clubs and playing alone by herself, which caused quite a sensation in St. Andrews at that time. Women just didn't play over the men's links in that way, but she did. And what that tells you is that women always wanted to play. They started playing putting games on a little course the caddies had made for themselves near Old Tom's shop, because that's where they would wait to get a bag. And then they would have little money games, the caddies, on their putting course. And then the ladies wanted to play, so they just started going over there and playing on the putting course. And after that, their men didn't quite like for them to be hanging out with ruffians like the caddies. So they asked Old Tom to build them a course, and he did. He built the Himalayas putting green in 1867, and that became the first actual women's golf course. Women's golf spread pretty quickly after that. You have to keep in mind that 1890 is the year that John Ball, the Englishman, becomes the first Englishman to win an Open, and that's pivotal to the evolution of golf. Very soon after that, women's golf gets going really seriously south of the border. St. Andrews and Westward Ho had always had this link, family links, and Westward Ho built a putting course identical to the Himalayas almost a year after the Himalayas was installed, and women started playing golf there. But English women took to the game very quickly and aggressively, and by the early 1890s, they were ready to form their own golf union. And in 1893, the Ladies' Golf Union was formed by Isette Pearson with the assistance of Dr. William Laidlaw Purvis and a number of other key men in the game. And that is sort of the starting point of great women's golf. That they held the first championship that year in 1893 at the St. Anne's Old Links there. And from then on, women's championship golf begins. Almost simultaneously, women's golf is exploding all over the world, unbeknown to Isette Pearson, who's the principal founder. Women's golf was taking off along the eastern seaboard of the United States, where starting in 1888 with St. Andrew's Golf Club in Yonkers, clubs started forming in a more permanent way in the United States. Golf had been played in the United States much, much earlier, but never in a permanent way, always sort of Scotch settlements that came and went. And so the first women's championship was held in the United States in 1894 as well. And women's golf is blooming in Scotland and in South Africa and other places. So there's this great groundswell of women's golf just in the very same time that golf is moving out of Scotland into England. It's moving for both men and women, although in most cases when the history of the game is written, it's only the men's story that gets told, which is probably true of a lot of things in this world. But so, yes, it was growing and thriving all that time. And, the thing is, golf always depends on superstars arriving, like Tommy Morris or John Ball or Harry Vardon, or in the men's game. The women's game had superstars who came along early. And the first two, Shane, I'm sure you know very well, were Irish women. May Heslett and Rona Adair were the first big, giant superstars of women's golf, particularly Rona Adair. She toured the United States in 1903. Made quite a sensation, helped to spread the love for women's golf in the United States in that way. She played individual matches against old Tom Morris without strokes and was 1-1 against him, although in Tom's defense, he was 80 then. And what was really amazing is that Tom played so well, not so much that Rona played so great as that an 80-year-old man could still golf well enough to hold his own with somebody who was 19 or 20 at the time and a really, really great player. So, in that way, the game expanded to just as it did for men. And, I think the real turning point comes in 1908 when the women, for the very first time, are invited to conduct their championship at St. Andrews and to tour the Royal and Ancient and to fly the Ladies Golf Union flag above the Royal and Ancient, which was a very massive deal for the women's game. And but more important even than that was the arrival of a player at that tournament called Cecil Leach, who is from Silloth. And Cecil was the breakthrough women golfer. She was the first golfer to really lash at the ball in the same way that men did, and she ushered in a whole new era of golf. Not many years later, as we find everything repeats in the United States that begins in Britain. That's true of the men's game, including like the PGA Championship and everything like that, repeats almost identically in America. And America breeds a star that lashes at the ball in the same way that Cecil does too, and that's Alexa Sterling. And the arrival of Alexa Sterling and Cecil Leach, to my mind, marks the beginning of modern women's golf. And when women are really, hitting the ball firmly enough to make it check and stop on the green, to be able to fire at the flag instead of just sort of, and driving the ball far enough now to be able to reach greens with irons rather than always with woods and that sort of thing. So I look at that as the turning point, and that's what sets the stage for the arrival of Joyce and Glenna.
So I believe Cecil Leach was from a little place in Cumbria called Silloth on Solway. And yes. Alexa Sterling was from the East Lake Golf Club in Atlanta, Georgia, contemporary of young Robert Tyre Jones Jr.
Yes, they grew up together. Both of them were sickly children, and their parents did not want them to go to school at a public school, whereas anybody who has children in school knows that there are all kinds of germs and diseases there, and so they homeschooled them. And not only that, they didn't want to live in the city, because in those eras, cities were not the clean places they are now, or not a lot less clean in any case. And they moved out to the country where they were just starting to build this golf course, Eastlake. Both of them, their parents did. And so they grew up together as children. And when the war came, they had already distinguished themselves as promising young golfers, and they were part of a foursome that toured the eastern seaboard of the United States, primarily out a little to the Midwest, called the Dixie Whiz Kids. Bobby Jones, Alexa Sterling, Perry Adair, and one woman from Chicago who had nothing to do with Dixie, but got roped into it. Her name was Elaine Rosenthal. And they did a lot of Red Cross tours and raised quite a substantial sum of money for the war effort. So, yes, they became famous together as children. And that had a lot to do with Alexa becoming as famous as she did, although she was a truly superb golfer in her own right.
And you mentioned Azette Pearson there in your introduction. I
Mhm.
believe she was central to noticing Cecil and her sister in the first place, but also suggesting to her that she move to one of the, I think she moved to London, and they sorted her out on the county team, which obviously gave her significant exposure to better competition and more competition.
No doubt about it. Isaac Pearson is the most significant figure in the history of the women's game in terms of it's Isaac Pearson, along with Mabel Stringer, Eleanor Helm, and a few other women, Blanche Martin, and others who really organized golf for women beginning in 1893 in an incredible way. They create an entire competitive world of women's golf starting from scratch with one championship. And, by within half a dozen years or so, the women have a competitive calendar that is nearly as busy as the men's calendar. And, Isaac understood instinctively and was herself a very fine golfer, that women going to need to, you know, if they're going to play as well as men or show that are able to develop the same skill as men, which was their absolute goal from the get-go, they need really tough competition in the same way that men have. And they founded the county golf system together, Mabel Stringer and Isette Pearson. And, that provided you a series of really intense matches, home and home matches against the rival counties in your area. First one, of course, being the home county surrounding London, which is where most things begin in that part of the world. And, so, that really sharpened the game for women. And Isaac was always looking for opportunities to bring the women's game forward. And the minute Cecil Leach came to the fore, she was all about the Leach sisters succeeding because she understood very well that Cecil was a transformative figure. And she needed to do every single thing that was within her power to give Cecil the opportunity to succeed and be what she could be to the game. And she did do that many times, first off, by altering the rules of who was eligible to play for England versus Scotland in the international matches, lowering the age limit so Cecil could be on the team, giving her some exposure to high-end match play, arranging matches for her against key men, including the big 1910 match against two-time amateur and two-time Open champion Harold Hilton, and also later altering the county golf rules so that if you weren't in your native county and you had moved to another county and lived there at least 2 years, then you could play for that county, all done specifically to pave the way for Cecil to get the level of competition she clearly needed to. She was 17 when she showed up at St. Andrews in 1908. And, she needed some seasoning before she could start winning championships. And Cecil's probably the most star-crossed golfer in history in certain ways because she finally comes of age and wins the British Ladies Championship in dominant fashion, following it by a dominant win in the French Open. And it's very clear that she is ready to sweep before her anyone. And then, of course, a month later, the war is declared and there's no one to fight for another 6 years or so. And, even after that, her first Open gets canceled by a rail strike. So she just got robbed of so many opportunities to add to the ladies' championships that she did win. But what a wonderful golfer she was.
It strikes me, Cecil, I believe, was self-taught, and juxtaposing the fact that Alexa, based at Eastlake, would learn the game from the great Stuart Maiden, no less. I suppose back then, from a geographical perspective, Sylhet was, before she moved to London, obviously, Sylhet was a relative backwater. So she really had no idea how good she was relative to the rest of the golfing population.
No, she did not. And, it's true that Cecil was self-taught, but it is also true that when she played these matches against leading men, uh, like Tom Ball or her own pro at Sylhet, Tommy Renouf, who was himself a fine golfer, she did get tips from them. She didn't take formal lessons from them, but they gave her pointers and stuff. And she developed, her hero in golf was James Braid, the Walton Heath pro for her time. And she became obsessed with his book, Advanced Golf. And that is really where she got her tuition in the game of golf, was principally by reading that book. And she read it so often and with such passion that it had to be confiscated from her at school so she would concentrate on her lessons. So she did get some instruction, and she, of course, became close friends with Braid, and I'm sure Braid gave her plenty of advice about her game, although probably not formal lessons. But so she certainly learned a lot from those associations, and particularly from her association with Braid, who obviously was one of the great golfers of that age or any age.
And I'm just wondering, Stephen, writers like Horace Hutchinson, Bernard Darwin, Obie Keeler, and indeed in an Irish context, Lionel Hewson, played important roles in providing coverage of championships and ongoing commentary on the evolving men's game from the 1880s. Who were the corresponding torchbearers for the women's side of the game? And how did this coverage evolve over those first few decades from the early 1890s?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm really delighted that you asked it, because there are two figures that are really major in terms of women's golf correspondence. One of them is Mabel Stringer. Mabel Stringer was the best friend of Isaac Pearson, and she was the daughter of a fairly well-to-do solicitor in New Romney. And she was basically living the life that a well-to-do person would live, playing golf, not having a care in the world, not needing a job. And then, as the great Gillian Kirkwood helped me discover, she actually discovered this in her own research, stumbled across it, and shared it with me, which was wonderful of her. And then the New Romney Public Library helped me figure out the rest. But in any case, her father got accused of embezzlement for government authorities that he worked for. And that just destroyed their family, even though, like, within a few months, he was acquitted of all charges. But, in that age where reputation was everything, their family was pretty much destroyed by the accusation, even though it turned out to be untrue. And Mabel, as she writes in her own reminiscences, was forced to become, quote, a toiler in life's garden. And what she ended up doing, she tried a few things, ladies' companion, this and that, but she ended up deciding to be a golfing correspondent because she was an outstanding player herself, although she had a lot of illnesses and injuries over her life. She wasn't a well person and didn't end up having great successes, but she was a very good golfer. And she became the first full-time women's golf correspondent. And she wrote for The Gentlewoman and various other publications about the women's game. And she would often provide correspondence overseas for when something huge happened, like Cecil Leach making her debut at St. Andrews in 1908 and causing a huge sensation. Mabel would tell that story to the world. She also was, Isaac Pearson was a very fierce and formidable woman. She got referred to by the press as more fearsome than the Tsar of Russia. But Mabel was a lovable human, and Cecil Leach herself gave her the nickname Auntie Mabel. And so she was the approachable one at the Ladies Golf Union and sort of the friendly face. And she often was given, like when Alexa came in 1921 to play at Turnberry in the Ladies Championship, she was given the room next to Alexa to make sure Alexa felt welcome in Britain. And if she needed anything, she could ask Auntie Mabel about it. So Mabel Stringer was huge. Later, Eleanor Helm comes along, another very formidable woman golfer, and she becomes a correspondent, basically taking over for Mabel at certain publications and writing for other papers herself, Ladies Field, various places. And the two of them basically were the principal correspondents through the evolutionary age. But as you go on in time, the great women golfers often then become correspondents, like Enid Wilson is one of the distinguished correspondents in the history of golf, a three-time winner, consecutive winner of the British Ladies Championship. Dorothy Campbell Hurd, one of the greatest women golfers of all time, becomes the correspondent for U.S. Golf Illustrated when she marries a steel magnate in Pittsburgh and stays in America. And she's becomes a distinguished correspondent. So there's a long line of great women's correspondents, most of whom are completely unknown for the same reason that the women's game is not that well known. As not much popular history has been written about the women's game. Quite a lot of serious history has been done. But, serious history of the men's game is not very widely read either.
You mentioned World War I, and we must interrupt this broadcast and our story just momentarily with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, which of course led to the outbreak of World War One. All changes and changed utterly. You might remind us of the influence that World War One had on the world of golf, specifically the new demands and responsibilities that women embraced out of necessity, and how the acceptance of same led to a long overdue emancipation, both in Britain and Ireland and farther afield.
Well, that's an interesting question, too. Thanks for asking. The women's game, and I haven't mentioned this up to now, but I ought to have done, unfolds in lockstep with the larger movement of women to free themselves from the shackles of what was then an entirely patriarchal world, and in many respects remains pretty patriarchal. But for instance, namely, seeking the right to vote, both in the United States and Britain, all during the period where women's golf is coming of age. Women are fighting fiercely in Britain, often violently, arson campaigns, Emily Wilding Davidson running out onto the track at the Epsom Derby to grab the king's horse by the bridle and being trampled to death in the process. Golf courses being attacked. Herbert Asquith, the prime minister, being attacked 4 different times on a golf course because he was an opponent of suffrage. And so there's this struggle that women are going through to try to establish their rightful place in the world. And that unfolds in lockstep with the women's golf movement. And in many ways, what women were able to achieve on the golf course was living proof of their point that they could achieve as well as men could achieve, or if given an opportunity to do so. And they fought and earned their opportunity to do it. And so when the war comes, of course, everything changes, as you say, and in both the United States and in Britain, and most especially in Britain, women had to take jobs that men had vacated to go out and serve in the war effort. Alexa becomes an ambulance driver. Cecil works as a clerk. And also, they both play in exhibition matches to raise money for the war effort and participate in various other kinds of campaigns. And of course, what inevitably happens after the war is that the war earned for women what they could never earn for themselves, which was, it seemed silly after the war that women couldn't vote when they were absolutely essential to the running of the nation. And both women in the United States and women in Britain and elsewhere in the world earned the right to vote in the immediate aftermath of the war. Less so in Britain. In Britain, it was only women who were 30 or older, which was not the end of the fight. Interestingly, the fight continues through the age of Glenna and Joyce, and it's only on the eve of their great match at St. Andrews in 1929 is when the match takes place, but in 1928 is when British women finally, all women 21 or older, earned the right to vote in Great Britain in that year. So you can see how it all unfolds together. And of course, the first big match against a man that Cecil Leach has that I mentioned against Harold Hilton in 1910 is at the absolute height of the suffrage movement and entangles women's golf with the suffrage movement. And this was not accidental. The ladies' field at Isaac Pearson, this was hardly accidental. They wanted this match. And of course, Cecil won the match. Hilton had written many times that any prominent amateur could give a woman 9 strokes if they played from the same tee and defeat her. And he had done that many times. And he gave Cecil 9 over a 36-hole match, 9 each time, each 18. And Cecil beat him 2-1 with an absolutely heroic performance at the end at Sunningdale. And that you can imagine, Shane, how that was responded to in the political arena. There was a very famous and often republished political cartoon of a man wearing a placard that says, 2-time Open and Amateur Championship defeated by a mere girl. How about the votes for women now? And so, it was all part and parcel of that. And, Matchless tells that story too, along with the unfolding of the excellence of the women's game.
Look, thus far we've dealt with the early growth of the women's game and looked at some of the key movers and shakers that influenced those early years. I think it's about time that we turn our attention to the main event. Our 2 heroines in this Matchless story, Joyce Wethered and Glenna Collet. So over to you to provide us with a fitting introduction or vignette to the women in question. Who were they? Where were they from? Who nurtured and recognized their early talents?
We'll start with Joyce, because Joyce, I guess you might have noticed on Twitter the other day that I put a list out of the 10 greatest golfers, in my opinion, and it starts with Joyce. So that's probably a surprise to some people. Joyce was the daughter of Herbert Newton Wethered, who was a very prominent figure in golf, and in 1929 would write with Tom Simpson the classic book, The Architectural Side of Golf. He was also the father of Roger Wethered, who would be, I think, universally agreed to be, along with Cyril Tolley, the greatest amateur of the age between wars in Britain. Those two, Darwin certainly thought they were, and that's good enough for me. Roger was a member of the captain of the Oxford golf team, and therefore intimately involved in the Oxford and Cambridge Golfing Society. Joyce then grew up in this heady atmosphere of leading amateur golfers, her brother being one of the leading ones, Cyril Tolley being Roger's best friend. She hung out with them, played against them mostly. She mostly played against men as a young child. Her father loved golf. He was like a 6 handicap. Her mother played. I don't think she ever became better than a bogey golfer. So golf was a big family affair for them. She's born in 1903, and they're living in Surrey. And Herbert is a painter. Herbert's just a wealthy man. His father was in tech. I think he married into textiles, and his father had great generational wealth from coal mining. And so he was your classic all-rounder, wealthy English gentleman. He painted. He wrote books about Thackeray, about medieval art, and about golf. And so he was that kind of person. He homeschooled Joyce and Roger both. I think probably because he had very particular ideas about what they ought to know. And so she grew up in that atmosphere of golf. She became a member of the Surrey golf team as the 10th player on the team around when she was about 17 or 18. And in 1920, her friend Molly Griffiths, who was the leading player on the Surrey team, decided to play in the English championship at Sheringham. And as all women did, she needed a companion to go with her on the trip because women did not travel alone in the 1920s. And so Joyce decided to go as her companion. And while she was there, she'd just go ahead and throw in for the championship. She barely qualified. She shot 94 in the qualifying round and barely got in, but she did get in. And then once she got in, she went insane and just kept winning match after match after match. And as Eleanor Helm put it so brilliantly, Molly Griffith got knocked out in the first round. And she said everybody on Surrey stopped thinking about Molly and started focusing on her pale-faced pal. And her pale-faced pal just went right through to the end, and of course came up against Cecil Leach in the final. And to the great shock of the world, Joyce defeated Cecil in that final. And the most famous story, maybe one of the most 2 or 3 famous stories in all of golf, occurs on the 17th hole there. Joyce is putting to win the match. Just as she's drawing back her putter, the train comes in, blowing its whistle, making a huge amount of noise. Joyce appears not to notice it, strokes the putt in the hole, wins the match. Cecil is amazed, writes quite extensively about it in her memoir that she can concentrate at that level. Joyce is asked by a reporter afterwards if the train had thrown her off, and she says, "What train?" She hadn't noticed that there was a train because she was capable of that level of concentration. That's why she became such an enormously great golfer. So that's Joyce. She comes of age, 1920, she wins her first championship. She still has seasoning to go, and she won't then win her first British Ladies over Cecil until 1922, a couple years later. At the same time, across the pond in the United States, Glenna Collet was born 2 years later than Joyce, in 1903. Her father is a national cycling champion, an athletic-minded person. This is kind of an age in America when the new American woman is supposed to be being developed, and that is athletic and so forth and so on. And Glenna is just a natural athlete, natural competitor from day one. Her brother Ned has a baseball team. Glenna has the best arm on the team by a mile. Glenna's mother wants her to play sports desperately, but she doesn't want her to play baseball because that's not a sufficiently ladylike sport in her mother's mind. So she steers her toward tennis. Glenna becomes excellent at tennis. And then one day, her father, who belongs at Metacomet Golf Club there in Rhode Island, where she was born in New Haven, Connecticut, but moved up to Rhode Island as a child and lived on most of her life in Rhode Island. And so her father takes her to Metacomet Golf Club, and he's out playing with his pals, and she's hanging out at the club, and she's kind of on an upper veranda there, and she's watching him tee off on the first tee, and she thinks, wow, that looks cool. I want to try that. So she runs out to the first tee. I forget how old she is here, 16, but young, quite young, and tiny and thin. I don't think she weighs quite 100 pounds yet. And she says, hey, I want to hit one. And the guys are like, sure, whatever. So she takes one and she just belts it 100 yards right down the middle of the fairway with a great shot on her very first swing. And all the guys there are like, wow, the coming champion. And it turned out they were right. And so, Glenna then gets taken by her father on to see one of these exhibitions of the Dixie Whiz Kids of Bobby Jones, Alexa Sterling, Elaine Rosenthal, and Perry Adair that I mentioned earlier. And she is absolutely enchanted by Alexa. Of course, Alexa is super famous and great by then and has won an amateur championship. And so she decides right then and there what I want to be as a golfer and sets out to become one. And she starts to play locally, not well. It takes her a long time to become any decent at all. And the real turning point is she enters an Eastern Amateur Championship and happens to be seen by a man named H.B. Martin. H.B. Martin, Dickie to his friends, was a very prominent golf correspondent in early United States, and he wrote the very first significant history of the United States, 50 Years of American Golf. And he saw Glenna drive the ball, and by then Glenna was driving the ball very long distances. She would eventually become a monster long driver. In fact, she had for a while the record for a woman's drive of 307 yards with hickory clubs, I might point out. And he went up and asked her after the event, how long have you been playing golf? What's your game like? And she said, well, I can hit the ball far, but I basically can't do anything else. And so she was very frank. And he said, well, I know a guy that could teach you. Maybe you could come next week and get a lesson. And so he connected her to Alex Smith, the great Scotsman from Carnoustie, who had won the Open Championship, who had brothers who won the Open Championship. And she began to take lessons from Alex Smith. And that is the turning point. She then begins to be Alex Smith gets hired a year later as the professional at Bel Air Country Club in Tampa, Florida. This, United States has the disadvantage to Britain over the fact that large portions of the U.S. are snowed under for 6 months of the year. You're not playing golf there at all. And Rhode Island is one of those places, especially in that age. It's a little warmer now. But she went for January, February, and March, all of her competitive life to either Bel Air or Pinehurst. So she could continue to play and compete in the winter. And there was a large circuit of women's amateur tournaments all throughout Florida for that reason. So Bel Air, of course, is where Society of Golf Historians, Connor T. Lewis guy, is a member, and it's a wonderful and recently restored Donald Ross course. But so she went and took her lessons from Alec there and started winning tournaments. And in 1922, she wins her first U.S. amateur develops into, I think of Joyce as the greatest technician the game has known and the most perfect golfer the game has produced. I think of Glenna as the greatest competitor that golf has produced. She's loved competing, I think, more than any player, and her record in competition staggers the imagination, honestly.
Obviously, over the early years of the 1920s, Glenna and Joyce would become serial winners on either side of the Atlantic. But I believe it wouldn't be until the Women's Amateur at Troon in 1925 that Joyce and Glenna would meet in a match of significance. Perhaps you might tell us a bit about the 1925 match.
Yes, so all through 1922, 1923, 1924, Joyce and Glenna are becoming increasingly dominant on their opposite sides of the Atlantic. And so naturally, there's just big hue and cry for a match between them. And in August of 1924, for instance, Golf Illustrated US publishes a full-page spread that just is entitled Empresses of Golf. And it's got two beautiful studio portraits of Joyce and Glenna. Joyce has got on a sleeveless dress, and she's a very willowy person. Glenna's got her hands resting on her chin resting on her hands, looking, dreamily forward. And it just talks about how great they are and how the world is in store the match between us to a treat that's in store for the golf world at some time in the near future. And in the spring of the following year, the ladies' championship was always held at that time in May or thereabouts. And Glenna announced that she was going to cut short her annual visit to Bel Air and go play at Troon in 1925. Joyce, at that time, was thinking of retiring from golf already because she won the English Amateur Championship in 1920, 1921, 1922, 1923, and 1924, 5 consecutive times. No golfer in the history of the game has won any championship 5 consecutive times. So right there, Joyce separates herself from the entire world. She feels like Bobby Jones would some years later that maybe that's enough winning. She'd also won the ladies' championship in 1922, 1924. And so she had 2 ladies' championships and 5 English championships. She was inclined to call it a day. Joyce loved Scottish golf more than anything. She spent almost all of her childhood summers at Dornoch. And because of that, she became enchanted with the Scottish links and with the Scottish game. So when it was revealed that the tournament would be held at Troon, she thought, okay, I'll do one more and then I'll retire because it's going to be at Troon. And I want to go play that great championship links in a championship. So 1925, the 2 of them meet there. Glenna is coming off that 59 in 1 year that I talked to you about a minute ago, where she played 60 matches and was 59 and 1. She's done very well in the spring, and there's Joyce is obviously the dominant player, but I think Britain is more worried than ever about the possibility that the women's championship would be taken by an American. It had never been. And I think it's important, Shane, to let a tiny backdrop about men's golf in here because 1921, Jock Hutchinson won the Open and declared himself an American, and he carried the trophy back to America. 1922, Hagen won it. Americans had been starting to establish dominance in the Open, but they had never been able to conquer the ladies' championship. And so there was fear now. There was fear when Alexa came, but Cecil took care of that. And there was even greater fear when Glenna came. So they play their match. Everyone is hoping, of course, that their match will be in the final. But it turns out they get drawn against each other in the 3rd round. And they play easily the most brilliant golf that the ladies' championship had ever seen. Troon is set up. All the women's tournaments were set up at very long distances in this age, partly because of that tie-in with proving that we're as good as men with the suffragette movement and the whole thing. So Troon is playing 6,415 yards for this championship. I might point out that that's only 100 yards less than Lancaster Country Club played for the 2025 U.S. Women's Open, 100 years later. So they're playing from 6,415 yards. Women's par, I believe, and I'm older now, Shane, so my locked memory of every detail is not what it used to be, but I believe women's par is 79. They go around. Glenna loses by 4 and 3, but she is only 1 stroke over par at the time that she's beaten. Joyce is 6 under par after however many holes it is that you play to lose 4 and 3. Glenna writes in her memoir that she writes very soon after this that she just was staggered because she felt that she had played the most brilliant golf she'd ever produced in her entire life, and yet she was beaten 4 and 3. And she writes about how her best wish is that one day Joyce will come to America so that you can see this. This is a golfer like nothing you've ever seen. She's got the skill of Bobby Jones, the temperament of the fighting spirit of Jess Sweetser, and the temperament of Walter Hagen. This is just insane. So Glenna is just absolutely destroyed by how great Joyce is. And, Joyce is equally complimentary of Glenna. They go on, obviously Glenna stays to watch the rest of it. Everyone did in that age. And Joyce goes on to the final, and who should she meet in the final but Cecil? And Cecil had been playing kind of scratchy golf. She'd had actually quite a serious injury in her first trip to America in 1921, and I'm not sure if she's ever quite the same golfer after that, honestly. But Cecil had this capacity for shaking off terrible golf at the key moment, and the final between her and Joyce is an absolutely epic one in which Joyce does prevail, but only on the 37th hole. And so it's all a great back and forth battle. This is one in which Cecil's was described by Bernard. Think of Madame Defarge leading the women of Saint Antoine against the Bastille. Think of anything frightfully grand, and you will have a picture of Miss Leach in that match. It was just a really epic match. And the interesting thing to keep in mind is that if Joyce had finished out her round against Glenna with the pars for the remainder, which she had been doing all along with quite ease and often under par, she would have had a full score of 73. Which would be equivalent to the score that Arthur Havers made over the same course 3 times in a row during his Open Championship win in 1923, just 2 years earlier. She shot 75 in her battle against Cecil. So extraordinary scoring. And this is the one I love the most, Shane, is during the week, she had one of her walk-up matches was against Gladys Ravenscroft. Maybe the greatest golfer name of all time, Gladys Ravenscroft. But anyway, she was the winner of the British Ladies and the U.S. Amateur, one of the first people ever to complete that double. And Joyce went out against her at Troon from 6,415 yards in 33 shots. And needless to say, the match did not go 18. It finished 6-5, but 33 at Troon with hickory clubs in 1925. I don't know. How do you wrap your mind around that?
You mentioned that Joyce retired from championship play after winning the British Women's in 1925. She did continue playing other events, such as the Worplesdon foursomes, where she would perpetually dominate. Just wondering if you could speak to the role of mixed competition, matches and bisques and foursomes and better ball that sort of happened both in the USA and indeed in Great Britain.
If I had to say the thing that struck me the most about the research into this book, beyond the intimate relationship between the evolution of women's golf and the rise of the suffrage movement, was the fact that women and men played together all the time on a regular scheduled basis during the majority of this age. In England, particularly, there were, as soon as Cecil defeated Harold Hilton, there was very soon after that at Stoke Poges, there was the annual men versus women's match at Stoke Poges, which was a foursomes match. There was also London foursomes where men and women played together. There were, most celebratory events would often involve a mixed foursome, but the big one, starting in 1921, was the Worplesdon mixed foursomes, which was modeled specifically after the mixed foursomes at Wimbledon, figuring that if that was such an attractive feature, wouldn't one between the top women and men amateurs be one also? And in that first one, actually, Toni Torrance and Eleanor Helm, probably having her greatest day in life, defeated Joyce and her brother Roger in the final. But Joyce, this is another one of the, there's so many things that I think separate Joyce as a golfer, and this is one of them. Joyce, over a very long period of time, I think from 1921 to 1934, if I'm remembering my dates correctly, won the Warsombles mixed foursomes 8 times with 7 different men as her partner. Pretty much any man she was capable of grabbing by the scruff of the neck and dragging him across the line, except for her husband later. He's the only man she couldn't win with. But she won with Bernard Darwin even, and she has some hysterical things to say about playing with Darwin as your partner, who was notorious for his gross misbehavior on the golf course and his inability to control his temper, his crazy fits that he would have. So that's another fun thing people read in there. But I just think of that as one of the staggering accomplishments in the game, because this was not a minor event. Every British player of consequence played in it. And so to win that was amazing. To win it 8 times and to have 7 different partners in the doing of it just speaks to who was actually the responsible party for the victories.
That brings us on nicely to the greatest women's match ever played. St Andrews was announced as the host venue for the 1929 British Ladies' Championship. The attraction of the old Grade 2 would appear to have proved too much of an allure for Joyce, who emerged from her 4-year hiatus to head once more into the breach. What can you tell us about the 1929 championship?
It is definitely, I have no quarrel with the idea that it's the greatest women's match ever played. It's just, it's a ridiculously epic match, both in terms of the scoring and the vicissitudes of the match, the ups and downs of it. Glenna has been continuing to play great golf during the 4 years that Joyce has been retired, continuing her lifelong quest to win the British Ladies Championships, which would unfortunately ultimately be unsuccessful. No one would win the British Ladies Championship from America until 1947 when Babe Didrikson did it. And so she's of course going to play at St. Andrews. She's won the U.S. Amateur in 1928, so coming off of another victory. The U.S. Women's Amateur is in September, so it would be the thing she would come off of as her major. She would have played in the Eastern Amateur and the North and South Amateur at Pinehurst before leaving for Britain normally, but the big one was the U.S. Women's Amateur. She had won that in 1928. She would win it in 1921. She would win it in 1930, and so she, every single time she ever, this is another fact about Glenna that makes me feel like she's the greatest competitor of all time. Every time she lost the British Ladies Championship, she came home and won the amateur. And it was pretty amazing 4 different times. And, you just have to feel like the resilience of that to lose in May, often in incredibly crushing and heartbreaking fashion, twice having played the best golf she felt she'd ever played in her life. And all those years, 1925, 1928, 1929, and 1930, she came home and won the U.S. Amateur after that defeat. So something just insane about her. Joyce obviously has only been playing, she played sporadically for her Surrey team, and she played in the mixed foursomes and the London foursomes and 1 or 2 other events, but she obviously hasn't been competing at a championship level in the way that she would have played. She was worried about losing, Joyce was. She writes about that in her memoir, like she felt like, especially, the way Glenna was coming into the match from the United States. Glenna had been putting up some insane scores and was really playing brilliantly. And Joyce was concerned that she might lose. Glenna kind of, like any person who plays the old course for the first time, it's difficult to get the feel for it right away. And her opening matches she won, but she didn't win them in a way that made you feel like she was going to beat Joyce Wethered or any other really great player, to tell you the truth. It was a little scratchy and nervy. And but then in the last day, she just annihilated the 2 opponents she had to beat that day to get into the final. And Joyce was like, uh-oh, there could be trouble tomorrow. So they go out and they play. And I don't want to say too much about this because this is the main focal point of the book, but I will tell you a couple things. Joyce they play, as they always do, they play fairly far back. No one has written down the exact yardage that I could find, but Eleanor Helm reported that it was set 10 to 15 yards in front of the men's tees on most holes. So the course played 6,500 and change at that time. So I'm estimating that the women played about 6,350 at St. Andrews in 1929 or thereabouts. Anyway, Glenna's opening 9 score is 8 4s and 1 2 for a 34. And she takes a 5-up lead in the match, and Scotland is effectively losing its mind, especially Bernard Darwin, whose headline for one of his stories about it is ghastly, horrible, but true. And in any case, Joyce, as Joyce does, goes into that cocoon and there's, oh my God, just reels off a score that you can't believe. A Bobby Jones-like score over the old course and ends up victorious. And so it's just this incredible scoring. There's a moment when Joyce is taking the lead and Glenna starts fighting back, and you're not sure if Glenna's going to pull it out again. So it's a really exciting match characterized by astonishingly brilliant scoring and great sportsmanship too. And the 10,000 turned out to watch it, about the same as the 10,000 who turned out at Troon.
In the wake of the championship victory in 29 by Joyce, external events would come to affect the familial circumstances of the Wethereds. These events culminated in the Great Depression and led to a number of lifestyle and professional choices from Joyce. What can you tell us about her books, a job at Fortnum and Mason, and a US tour in 1935?
Herbert Newton's wealth was mostly invested in United States concerns. So when the stock market crashed in 1929, and in the ensuing years, he lost the vast majority of what he owned. He had to sell the family's home and move to a smaller house, and Joyce had to go get a job and move out of the house, actually, for the first time in her life. So she didn't have any trouble finding work, and she didn't have any trouble finding remunerative work. She was hired immediately as the golf, I forget what the actual title was, but in charge of the golf department at Fortnum and Mason. And she was getting £600 a year to do that. She, of course, sacrificed her amateur status by doing so, but didn't stop her from playing in the Worpeldom's foursomes or from Surrey. It just stopped her. She never had any intention of competing in other championships anyway, so it didn't really matter. But she was then approached to put together a line of golf clubs. And part of that was this idea that she would tour the United States to sell the golf clubs and to, promote Fortnum and Mason equipment and all this, and the Wanamaker department stores in Philadelphia, Alexander Finlay. And I do need to stop and make one small aside here that's got nothing to do with my book. Is a guy named William Casto has written a book about Alexander Finlay called The Ambassador, and he gave me the privilege of reading it in advance and offering him a few thoughts on it. And it's just a really excellent book about a really pivotal figure in the evolution of American golf. It's going to be published this year by Back Nine Press, and it's one that I think people should pick up. He did an amazingly great job. It's Alexander Finlay who arranged all of Harry Vardon's tours of the United States, and it's Alexander Finlay also who arranges Joyce's tour. So Joyce comes to the United States in 1935, and she makes a tour of the U.S. and Canada, and plays in a number, I think it's 76 different matches, 53 matches, I believe. Anyway, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but she plays extensively all across the country, all on courses she's never played, usually against prominent amateurs, most often in a mixed format. Just as Britain had the mixed foursomes, the United States also did a lot of mixed golf from 1924 on. For about 6 years, the Fairfield Country Club up in Connecticut had something called the Gold Ball Tournament, where men and women played together as a team against one another, and then against your partner as an opponent for one of the matches. So Glenna would team up with Jess Sweetser. They both won their amateurs in 1922. They dominated the event, actually, and Glenna beat Jess a couple times with strokes. But so anyway, she comes to the United States. She does all this huge tour. She sets an obscene number of records at the courses she plays, playing them all from the far back tee, playing them all for the first time. She'd never seen them in her life. Most of them are grasses that she's unfamiliar with, like all through the South. She's playing on Bermuda grass, which anybody who's ever played on that knows it's an incredible puzzle. I think Ted Ray called it more like playing with grapevines than grass. And but she has an average score of 76 over the course of these, I believe it is 53 matches that she plays, traveling all over the world. The first opening match is supposed to be Joyce and Bobby Jones against Glenna and Gene Sarazen. So you talk about a banger of a match, but Jones gets ill and doesn't get to play, and eventually the two of them do have a match together from the back tee at Eastlake. That's one of the highlights of this book, too. And Joyce pretty much matches Jones stroke from 6,600 yards at Eastlake in 1929 with hickory clubs. And I think Jones shoots 71 and she shoots 74. But she, lazily three-putted a hole when the match was over because it was a match of Joyce and a man named Charlie Yates versus Bobby and a young woman named Dorothy Kirby. But so just spectacular stuff. She plays with Glenna multiple times in the match, sort of as a reunion. I think they play 5 or 6 matches together. She plays with Marion Hollins out at Pasatiempo, and she plays at Pebble Beach. And she just sees a lot of American golf and honestly staggers America with the brilliance of her golf and the brilliance of her swing. Grantland Rice, the great American sports writer, wrote a piece about her for the American Golfer about how astonished he was at her swing, but how even more astonished he was at the thorough understanding she had of the mechanics of the golf swing. I think she understood it as well as any person, and she wrote about it extensively. Part of the other thing she did in response to this Great Depression was write a book called Golfing Memories and Methods. That is her memoir and part instruction. The instruction is brilliant, relevant today to both men and women. She had written an earlier instructional book with her brother called Golf from Both Sides, and she wrote extensively for other publications for the Ladies Fields, the Ladies Golf Union's home publication, I think called Fairway and Hazard. She wrote extensively for Lonsdale Library's Golf about the golf swing, and Rice was just amazed by how articulate she was about the particulars of the swing and what she knew. And as part of that tour, a man named Hal Rhodes in Canada took videos of her swing and matched them up against videos he had taken of Bobby Jones' swing. And you can see by looking at those that she did a wonderful job of mimicking Jones' swing because they're almost identical. Joyce is a bit taller than Bobby is. Joyce is almost 6 foot tall, and Bobby is like 5'8" or so.
Stephen, as we start to wrap up, you might provide us some commentary on the legacies that those two great friends, Joyce Wethered and Glenna Collet, have left on the furtherance of both the women's game and the game of golf in general.
That's a great question. Excellence that Joyce and Glenna achieved at golf narrowed the proverbial gap between men and women more than it had been ever before, and I believe as much as it ever has been since. So that's one legacy. The crowds that they could generate, the quality of their play, the excitement that women's golf was creating at that time made it possible for the LPGA to begin, and it would have begun, I believe, much sooner after Joyce's tour of the United States had another war not erupted. It did begin the first attempts at an LPGA in 1944, the very first year that the war ended. So I believe they are the momentum that creates the possibility of an LPGA, and that's probably their greatest legacy. But they also, I think they left a sporting legacy because their competition was an intense one, and both of them wanted to win, but it was absolutely brilliant sportsmanship on both ends. And obviously you have to give Glenna the lion's share of the credit for that because she was almost always a loser. I should point out the one glorious victory that she did have is in the first Curtis Cup match with Joyce as the captain of the British team, and Glenna, who recently married and so not captain, but playing as the lead player on the U.S., her and her partner, Opal Hill, defeat Joyce and her partner, Wanda Morgan, in the foursomes. And that turns out to be the winning point in the Curtis Cup match. And the Curtis Cup is the very first time that Americans break through what had been the impregnable fortress of British women's golf. And so you got to give Glenna some credit for that glorious victory. But they leave a legacy of brilliance that leads to the LPGA. And that's really and also that proved the larger point of the women's rights movement, that women were fully capable of excellence equal to men's, and in the case of Joyce, superior. Bobby Jones himself wrote that Joyce was the best player he had ever seen, man or woman, and he's the only player he'd ever played against who made him feel completely outclassed.
Well, Stephen, that concludes our deep dive into the story of the evolution of the women's game. Before we bid you adieu, you might just share with us when your publisher, Berlin Books, expects the first copies of Matchless to be available for purchase.
Their publication date is scheduled for the first week of October, the idea being to catch the holiday market when most people buy books, so I'm very excited about that. It usually arrives in the United States a little later, so I would say probably, I don't know what their plans are for getting it over to the United States, but it's in my experience, it's taken a month or two, so maybe, hopefully before Christmas, but if not early January, you should be able to get it in the United States.
Well, I would endorse anybody thinking of learning more about these two titans of the game. You will not be disappointed in purchasing a copy. Before signing off, it would be remiss of me not to inquire, what are the next things on your to-do list from a writing and publishing perspective?
Well, what I would really like to do, Shane, and this is might be a bridge too far. I really want to do a biography of Bernard Darwin that would be called Bernardo, the man who invented golf writing. The trouble with it is that a person who has been as retired as long as I does not have the resources that are required to do the research. So I need to figure out a means of acquiring either grants or larger advances than I've typically gotten, or some other means of financing an extended stay in England, which is what I think would be necessary to do such a work. You would need to attend the Halford Hewitt Cup, the President's Putter, the boat race at Oxford and Cambridge, the things that are formative in Bernard's writing life. So I'm hoping that I can figure out how to pull that off. And so along those lines, when I was doing the research for this book, I read all of the women's golf coverage in Golf Illustrated US from 1912 through 1935 inclusive. And as part of that, I noticed that Bernard Darwin was hired by Golf Illustrated US to write a column during the wartime. And I'm planning to collect those columns and write a piece about them for the Lynx Diary. And I'm supposed to turn that into them in November, and that get me on the Darwin pathway. But I'm trying to work out with various people in the industry if there's a way that I could get finance to do this Darwin biography, which I would dearly like to do. As you know, Darwin is my hero of heroes. And it amazes me that a complete biography of him has not yet been written. So that would be my hope. We'll see. I have other ideas if that doesn't work out, but I hope to do that.
I can think of no other person that I would rather take on that particular project. So best of luck. Listen, all that's left to do is to thank you for your time as always. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of the golfing world for investing so much time and effort into illuminating and educating all of us here in the ether about past titans of the game whose stories have provided foundational influence that still resonates to this day. I look forward to chatting with you soon. Go easy, mate.
Shane, thank you so much for having me. It means a lot because it's hard to sell golf books, and every little opportunity like this helps you do it. So I'm grateful to you. You have a great podcast. I enjoy listening to it, even when I'm not on it.
Well, you're more than welcome. And you're more than welcome back to talk about your Darwin book.
One of these days, I hope so. I'm a relentless guy. I'm not going to give up easy.
Cheers, mate. Take it easy.
Cheers.
Many thanks for tuning in. If you don't currently follow us on socials, you can do so as follows. On X, you can find us at Firm and Fast Golf. On Instagram, Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. On Blue Sky, if you're that way inclined, the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. On YouTube at the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. And indeed finally on Substack at the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast occasional newsletter. We favour to ask, if you're still with us, if you're enjoying the show, you might consider giving us a star rating or a review on your podcast platform of choice. It really would be appreciated. Thanks again for